The screen didn't flicker, it didn't pulse with the weight of what it had just delivered. It simply sat there, a cold, rectangular slab of glass and light, displaying the 6 words that had effectively ended my life as I knew it. Don't ever call me again. The period at the end of that sentence felt like a bullet hole. I stared at it until the blue light burned into my retinas, creating a ghostly afterimage of my son's rejection that followed me even when I finally forced my eyes shut. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of a suburban evening. It was a pressurized, deafening vacuum that rushed in to fill the space where a relationship used to be. My thumb hovered over the glass, trembling with a primal, maternal instinct to respond, to plead, to explain. But when I tapped his name, the realization hit. The little bubble didn't turn green or blue. There was no delivered status. There was only the hollow, digital void. I was blocked. I had been erased from his digital world with a single clinical swipe of a finger, the same finger I used to kiss when he was a toddler to make the awies go away. The living room, usually my sanctuary of beige linens and soft lamplight, suddenly felt like a stage set for a play that had been canceled mid-act. The sun was sinking behind the neighbors' tall oaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floor. I watched as a single sliver of orange light crawled across the mantel, illuminating the row of silver-framed photographs that I had curated like a shrine. There was Julian at 5, sporting a gap-toothed grin and a face smeared with chocolate. Julian at 17, stiff and awkward in his prom tuxedo. And Julian at 24, clutching his MBA with a look of arrogant triumph that I should have recognized as a warning sign. Now those faces felt like strangers. They were images of a person who no longer existed, or perhaps a person I had never truly known. The coldness in my chest wasn't just metaphorical, it was a physical chill that started in my sternum and radiated outward until my fingertips were numb. I felt as though my internal temperature had dropped 20 degrees the moment the connection severed. I have spent 30 years being Julian's mother. It was the primary title I claimed, the role that dictated every financial decision, every sacrifice, and every sleepless night. I had poured my life into his foundation, reinforcing his walls with my own strength, only for him to decide that the architect was no longer welcome in the building. To be discarded like a piece of obsolete software, something that had served its purpose and was now taking up too much memory, was a betrayal that felt visceral, like a physical blow to the stomach. I sat in my armchair, the one he used to jump on as a child, and felt the sheer oppressive scale of the house. It was 4 bedrooms of memories and empty air. The silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic, taunting tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second marking my new status as a non-person in my son's life. I found myself waiting for the phone to vibrate. It was a phantom sensation, a twitch in my thigh where I usually kept my cell. I imagined a follow-up text, a retraction, a "Mom, I'm sorry, I was just angry." But the phone remained a dead weight on the side table. The digital erasure was total. I was no longer a contact, no longer a recipient of his thoughts, no longer a part of his reality. He had cut the umbilical cord 30 years late, and he had done it with a jagged edge. I looked at my hands, aged and lined with the history of raising him, and wondered how they could feel so empty when they had held so much. The house, once a symbol of my success and my family's stability, now felt like a mausoleum dedicated to a ghost who was still walking the earth, breathing and choosing, actively choosing to pretend I didn't exist. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It was a dry, searing heat in my throat that made it hard to swallow the stale air of my new, solitary life. I was a woman who had been silenced by the very person I had taught to speak. The silence of the house was a heavy, physical thing, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear the frantic thrum of my own pulse. To distract myself from the digital tombstone that was my phone, I let my mind drift back, searching for the exact moment the soil began to sour. It wasn't a sudden landslide, it was a slow, agonizing erosion. I remember Julian at 7, a boy with perpetually bruised shins and a cowlick that defied every comb I owned. Back then, I was his entire world. If he fell, his eyes sought mine before the first tear even formed. He would reach for my hand in crowded grocery stores, his small, sticky palm a tether that anchored me to the earth. I lived for that wait, for the way he would press his forehead against my shoulder when he was tired, exhaling a sigh that smelled of milk and innocence. That Julian, the one who thought I was a magician because I could find his lost Lego bricks, is the one I find myself mourning tonight. The transformation was insidious. It started during his university years, a subtle hardening of his features and a sharpening of his tongue. He began to look at my home, my life, and my savings not as a testament to my hard work, but as a preliminary inheritance he was being unfairly denied. The MBA, which I had paid for by liquidating a significant portion of my retirement fund, seemed to grant him a degree in entitlement rather than business. He stopped asking for advice and started delivering mandates. Then came Vanessa. If Julian was the fire of resentment, Vanessa was the oxygen. She was a woman of sharp angles and expensive tastes, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, eyes that were always calculating the market value of the jewelry I wore or the square footage of my hardwood floors. Under her influence, Julian's requests for help morphed into aggressive demands for redistribution. I recall a dinner 2 years ago, the clinking of silverware against fine china sounding like a countdown. Vanessa had spent the evening discussing their lifestyle goals, her voice a polished, rhythmic drone about high-rise condos and summering in the Hamptons. Julian didn't look at me. He looked at his wine glass as he told me it was selfish of me to keep so much capital tied up in a house that was too big for one person. He spoke about my assets as if they were a communal pool he had a right to drain. When I suggested he build his own wealth as I had, his face contorted into a mask of cold fury I didn't recognize. The boy who used to cry over a broken crayon was now a man who looked at his mother and saw nothing but a stubborn obstacle standing between him and a larger bank balance. The pressure became a constant, low-grade fever in our relationship. Every phone call, once a source of joy, became a tactical negotiation. He would call to tell me he loved me, but the "I love you" was always a preamble to a request for a bridge loan that he had no intention of repaying. If I hesitated, he would bring up my failing memory or my inability to manage complex finances, gaslighting me into believing that giving him my money was actually a way of protecting myself. Vanessa sat in the background of those calls, her whispers prompting him like a malevolent director. I realized with a sickening jolt that I was no longer a person to them. I was a line item on their balance sheet. I was a depreciating asset that they were trying to liquidate before I became a liability. The maternal devotion that had been my North Star for 3 decades began to flicker and dim. It is a terrifying thing for a mother to realize she is being hunted by her own child. I watched him during our last face-to-face encounter, noting the way his eyes darted around my living room, probably mentally tagging the antiques for an estate sale. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a hungry, restless impatience. He didn't want my history. He didn't want the stories of his father or the lessons I had learned through decades of struggle. He wanted the liquidity. He wanted the life I had built, but he wanted me removed from the equation. As I sat in the gathering gloom of my quiet house, the realization finally took root. Julian hadn't just blocked my number. He had attempted to delete my humanity to make his betrayal easier to swallow. But as the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity, I realized that if I was just an account to him, it was time for that account to be closed. He wanted me out of his life, fine. But he had forgotten one crucial thing: the architect still held the keys to the vault. The kitchen, usually my sanctuary of rosemary and baking flour, was choked that afternoon by the acrid, oily stench of burnt coffee. I had left the pot on the burner too long, the liquid evaporating into a thick, black crust that mirrored the bitterness rising in my throat. Julian stood across the granite island from me, his expensive Italian suit jacket discarded on a stool, his silk tie loosened like a noose. He didn't look like my son, he looked like a debt collector. The desperation in his eyes was a jagged, frantic thing, casting shadows that made his face seem gaunt and predatory. He had come not for tea or conversation, but for a liquidation of his future, as he so coldly put it. He needed $200,000 to settle a private investment obligation, a phrase I knew was code for a gambling debt or a disastrous speculation fueled by Vanessa's thirst for status. "It's my money eventually anyway, Mom," he snapped, his palms slamming against the counter with a force that made the ceramic canisters rattle. "Why should I wait until you're in the ground to use what Dad and you built? I need it now. If I don't have it by Friday, I'm ruined. Do you want to see me ruined?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, and the excuses I had spent years meticulously crafting, the stress of his career, the influence of his wife shattered like cheap glass. I saw the entitlement etched into the lines around his mouth, the way he didn't even bother to hide his contempt for my frugality. When I told him softly that the money was tied up in annuities and that I wouldn't jeopardize my own stability to bail him out of another obligation, he changed. The mask of the grieving, struggling son fell away and something monstrous took its place. He began to speak of Arthur, my late husband, with a venom that robbed me of my breath. "Dad would have given it to me," Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl. "But then Dad always knew you were the one holding us back. He spent his whole life playing it safe because you were too afraid to actually live. He died in this mediocre house with a mediocre woman because he didn't have the guts to tell you no. And now you're doing it to me. You're hoarding his legacy like a dragon in a cave, and for what? To buy more yarn, to sit here and rot." The cruelty of it was a physical blow. Arthur had adored him. Arthur had worked 60-hour weeks at the firm specifically so Julian would never feel the hunger we had known in our 20s. To hear his father's sacrifice dismissed as mediocrity, to hear my own life characterized as rot by the person I had nurtured for 9 months in my body and 30 years in my heart, was the moment the cord finally snapped. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood there, my hands trembling slightly beneath the counter, watching this stranger breathe my air. "Get out, Julian," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine, keep your blood money, but don't expect me to be there when you finally realize how alone you are. Don't expect Vanessa to bring the kids over. You've made your choice. You chose your bank balance over your family." He grabbed his jacket, the fabric snapping in the air, and stormed toward the mudroom. The departure was violent. The heavy oak door didn't just close, it exploded against the frame, a thunderclap that rattled the windows and sent a decorative plate sliding off the wall to shatter on the floor. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, and absolute. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee still clawing at my lungs, and waited. I knew there would be a coda. Minutes later, the chime of my phone on the counter was like a gunshot. I didn't have to unlock it to see the message. It glowed on the screen, a final digital execution. Don't ever call me again. You're dead to us. I've blocked your number. Have a nice life with your money. I stared at the screen until it went dark. For years, I had viewed Julian through the lens of a mother's hope, seeing the toddler, the graduate, the boy who needed me. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the kitchen floor, that lens fell away. I saw him clearly, a man who would trade his mother's peace for a larger portfolio. I looked at the shattered plate on the floor, a piece of hand-painted stoneware Arthur and I had bought on our honeymoon in Amalfi. It was broken beyond repair. And as I reached for the broom, I realized that Julian had just done me a favor. He had shown me exactly who he was before I had the chance to give him everything. He wanted to be out of my life. He wanted me to be dead to him. I would grant him that wish. But death, as Julian was about to learn, has very specific legal implications when it comes to a last will and testament. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the sole executor of a legacy he had just spit upon. I walked to the phone, not to call him, but to dial my lawyer's private line. It was after hours, but for a client like me, he would answer. The architect was going to redesign the vault, and this time there would be no door left open for the son who had forgotten the value of the woman who built it. The first week of what I came to call the Great Silence was defined by the agony of phantom limbs. My life had been so thoroughly entwined with the role of mother, a role that involved constant monitoring, subtle cushioning, and the perpetual anticipation of Julian's needs, that my brain didn't quite know how to process the sudden amputation. My thumb would hover over the messaging app on my phone, twitching with the muscle memory of 30 years, before the icy reality of his final words froze my heart anew. I'd see a segment on the evening news about a tech startup in the city, the kind of thing Julian used to ramble about with a frantic, caffeinated energy that I once mistook for ambition, and my first instinct was to record it or send a link. Then the silence would rush back in, a cold, heavy tide pulling me away from the shore of my own habits. It wasn't just the lack of communication. It was the sudden, jarring absence of the noise he brought into my world. Julian didn't just visit, he occupied space. He left a trail of damp towels, half-finished cups of expensive coffee, and a lingering sense of dissatisfaction that seemed to coat the furniture like dust. Without him, the house felt cavernous, the silence monolithic. It sat in Arthur's empty armchair. It hovered over the stovetop, where I no longer felt the need to prepare a Sunday roast that could feed a small army. For the first few days, I moved through the rooms like a stranger, startled by the lack of friction. I found my sanctuary and eventually my strength in the dirt. Julian had always been allergic to the mundane labor of the outdoors, as he called it. He'd stand on the patio in his polished loafers, checking his watch while I knelt among the perennials, complaining that the smell of mulch and damp earth clung to my clothes and devalued the aesthetic of the property. Now, that mulch was my incense. I spent the humid afternoons of that first month attacking the flower beds with a ferocity that surprised even me. The garden had become overgrown in the long, exhausting months of Arthur's decline and the subsequent chaos of Julian's escalating demands. There were dandelions with taproots that seemed to reach the very center of the earth, and creeping Charlie that strangled the delicate pansies I had planted in the spring. Each weed pulled was a small, private exorcism. I didn't just tug at the surface. I dug deep with the trowel, pushing my weight into the handle until I felt the snap of the root, ensuring not a single fiber of the invasive growth remained to haunt the soil. I thought of Julian's entitlement as the thistle, prickly, demanding, and capable of choking out everything beautiful if left unchecked. I worked until my fingernails were stained black and my lower back throbbed with a dull, honest ache. In that physical exhaustion, there was no room for the frantic, looping why that usually plagues a rejected mother. There was only the soil, the sun, and the slow, methodical process of reclamation. I was weeding him out of my daily rhythm, one root at a time. The social world, however, was less manageable than the garden. In our small town, news of a family rift travels with the speed of a brush fire, fueled by the dry tinder of gossip. At the market, I encountered Martha Gable, a woman whose primary hobby was the curation and dissemination of other people's tragedies. She approached me near the organic produce, her head tilted at that specific, nauseating angle of practiced sympathy that makes you want to scream. "Eleanor, dear," she whispered, her hand fluttering toward my arm like a moth drawn to a flame. "We haven't seen Julian's car in weeks. Is everything quite all right?" I heard from Sarah that Vanessa mentioned a transition in the family. We're all so concerned. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a strange, crystalline clarity. A month ago, I might have made an excuse. I might have lied to protect his reputation or my own pride, painting a picture of a busy son and a doting grandmother. But the silence had sharpened me. It had stripped away the need for performance. "Julian has requested a period of absolute privacy, Martha," I said, my voice as steady and cool as the stone fountain in my garden. "And I am honoring that request to the letter. It's remarkably peaceful, actually. How are your azaleas?" The look of stunned disappointment on her face was a tonic. She wanted tears. She wanted the sordid, jagged details of a mother's heartbreak so she could trade them for social currency at her bridge club. I gave her nothing but a polite, distant nod and moved on to the heirloom tomatoes. I realized then that I wouldn't be chasing him. I wouldn't be the mother who cried to his friends or sent thinking of you cards that would only be tossed in the trash with a sneer. I wouldn't use our mutual acquaintances as couriers for my grief. If he wanted me dead, I would be a ghost of the highest caliber, silent, unseen, and utterly indifferent to his needs. This shift from raw grief to hard clarity wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the slow, pressurized hardening of carbon into a diamond. Every time I passed the guest room, the one he'd stayed in during his last visit, leaving it a mess of discarded expectations, I felt less of a sting and more of a resolve. I eventually went in there, stripped the bed, and laundered the linens with a double dose of bleach. I scrubbed the baseboards until they shone. I cleared out the closet where he'd left an old suit he didn't have room for in his city apartment. I boxed it all up and drove it to the donation center without a second thought, watching the box disappear into the bin with a sense of profound relief. The house began to feel lighter. The shadows Julian had cast with his constant, low-level simmering resentment began to lift, replaced by a quiet that I finally stopped trying to fill with noise. I found myself sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass, realizing that for 30 years I had been subconsciously adjusting my volume to suit his temperament. Now the only sound was the wind in the maples and the occasional chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a solitude I hadn't asked for, but it was becoming a gift I was finally learning how to open. I was no longer waiting for the phone to buzz with a demand or a grievance. I was waiting for the lawyer to call back with the final ironclad documents. The pruning was almost complete, and for the first time in a long time, the garden was mine alone. The silence I had cultivated like a rare fern in my garden suddenly turned on me at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't the peaceful, reflective quiet of the previous weeks. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud. I woke with a sensation that felt less like pain and more like a heavy stone had been placed squarely in the center of my chest. For a terrifying minute, I lay there, staring at the shadows of the maple branches dancing on the ceiling, trying to determine if I was having a nightmare or if my body was finally surrendering to the stress I thought I had mastered. Every breath felt shallow, a sip of air instead of a full draft, and a cold, clammy sweat began to prickle along my hairline. I didn't call for help, not at first. My first instinct, honed by decades of motherhood, was to reach for the phone on the nightstand to call Julian. My thumb hovered over the screen, the ghost of a habit nearly overriding the reality of our silence. Then the memory of his voice, cold, dismissive, telling me to never call him again, hit me with more force than the pressure in my chest. If I called him now, while I was gasping for air, would he even pick up? Or would he see my name on the screen and roll his eyes, telling Vanessa that she's at it again, trying to guilt trip us with a fake emergency? That thought was the shot of adrenaline I needed. I didn't call him. I took an aspirin, sat on the edge of the bed until the world stopped spinning, and drove myself to the 24-hour clinic 3 miles away. The clinic was a cathedral of neon and linoleum, smelling of industrial lavender and ozone. As I sat in the waiting room, the only soul under the flickering fluorescent lights, the logistics of my mortality began to assemble themselves with clinical precision. A nurse with tired eyes and a kind smile took my vitals, her touch cool and professional. She didn't know that my son had discarded me. To her, I was just another cardiac workup, a woman of a certain age whose heart might be failing. But as I waited for the EKG results, staring at a poster about shingles vaccinations, a fierce, white-hot clarity settled over me. If my heart had stopped in that bed an hour ago, the machinery of the law would have swung into motion with an indifference that mirrored Julian's. Within days, he would have been standing in my foyer, keys in hand. He and Vanessa would have walked through my garden, the garden I had bled for, and discussed which trees to tear out to make room for a modern patio. They would have gone through my jewelry box, appraising the pearls my mother gave me, and calculated the resale value of the mahogany dining table where he used to do his homework. Every cent of my savings, every brick of the house I had maintained through sheer force of will after his father died, would have become his. It would have been the ultimate reward for his cruelty. The inheritance would have been the final thank you for his abandonment, a golden handshake for a son who had told his mother she was dead to him. The tests are clear, Eliner, the doctor said, appearing in the doorway with a clipboard. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a severe panic attack, likely exacerbated by exhaustion and stress. Your heart is actually quite strong, but you need to listen to what your body is telling you. I thanked him, but I knew my body wasn't just telling me to rest. It was telling me to protect myself. I walked out of that clinic as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. I didn't go home to sleep. I sat in my car in the parking lot and waited until 9 o'clock, the exact minute the law offices of Miller, Vance, and Associates opened their doors. Arthur Miller had been my attorney for 30 years. He had handled my husband's estate, my own business filings, and the trust I had set up for Julian when he was 18. When I called him, my voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of the woman who had stared down Martha Gable at the market, steady, cool, and utterly certain. Arthur, I said when he finally came on the line, I need to see you this morning. We need to discuss my will. I'm making some significant revisions, and I need them to be ironclad. I want to ensure that not a single blade of grass on this property, nor a single penny in my accounts, ever finds its way into Julian's hands. I'm cutting him out, Arthur, completely. I want to leave it all to the local botanical society and the animal shelter. Let's make sure there isn't a loophole he can crawl through. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Arthur knew Julian. He had seen him grow up. Eliner, he said softly, that's a very final decision. Are you sure you don't want to sleep on it? Family rifts can sometimes. I've had a very long night of sleeping on it, Arthur, I interrupted, watching a sparrow land on my side mirror. I've realized that a will is a final statement of values, and my values no longer include subsidizing the life of a man who treats my existence as a burden. I'll be in your office in 20 minutes. As I put the car in gear, the weight on my chest finally lifted. The pruning wasn't just for the garden anymore, it was for the legacy. I was no longer a victim of his silence, I was the architect of my own ending. The house was mine, the money was mine, and for the first time in my life, my future belonged to no one but myself. Arthur's office was a sanctuary of heavy mahogany and the ghosts of 1,000 disputes. It smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and the faint, acidic tang of lemon furniture polish. As I stepped through the heavy oak door, the world outside, the morning traffic, the chirping sparrows, the neon-lit memories of the clinic seemed to dissolve into the hush of leather-bound law books. Arthur stood as I entered, his silver hair catching the light from the tall windows that looked out over the courthouse square. He didn't offer a platitude or a sympathetic pat on the hand. He simply pulled out the heavy chair for me, his expression a mask of professional neutrality that I deeply appreciated. We had known each other for decades, but today I didn't need a friend. I needed a surgeon of the law. I have the current draft here, Elena, he said, his voice a low rumble. He spread the thick, cream-colored pages across the desk. The 2018 version. It leaves the entirety of the estate, including the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, and all personal effects to Julian, with a secondary provision for his children should he have any. I looked at the name Julian on the page. It looked like a foreign word, a sequence of letters that no longer held any warmth. Let's start with the house, I said, my voice steady. The Victorian on Elm Street. I want it sold upon my death. Every cent of the proceeds is to be used to establish the Thomas Vance Memorial Scholarship at the university's College of Engineering. Thomas loved his work, and he would have wanted to help students who actually value hard work and legacy. I thought of the mahogany dining table, the one where Julian had carved his initials when he was 7. I had been so angry then, but Thomas had just laughed and said it gave the wood character. Now that character would be auctioned off to fund a stranger's education. It felt like an act of justice. Arthur's pen hovered over his notepad, and the investment accounts, the blue chip stocks and the liquid assets. I want them placed into a permanent endowment for the Grace Harbor Women's Shelter, I replied. I want it structured so that the principal remains untouched, but the interest provides a continuous operating budget for their vocational training programs. If I am to be discarded by my own family, I will at least ensure that women who have been discarded by society have a place to rebuild. We went through the list with clinical precision. The silver tea set that had belonged to my grandmother, the one Vanessa had already eyed for her sideboard, to be donated to the city's historical society. My engagement ring, the diamond that caught the light even in the dimness of the office, to be sold, the proceeds added to the scholarship fund. The heirlooms were no longer memories, they were assets to be reallocated. Each stroke of Arthur's pen felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself that I had previously ceded to a future that no longer existed. And finally, I said, leaning forward, the leather of the chair creaking under me, the matter of Julian himself. Arthur looked up, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. You want to disinherit him completely. You mentioned that on the phone. I do, but I know how he is, Arthur, and I know Vanessa. If I simply leave him out, they will claim I was of unsound mind. They will say I was confused or that I had forgotten him in a fit of pique. I want to ensure he cannot contest this. Arthur nodded slowly. The $1 clause, we acknowledge his existence, we acknowledge the relationship, and we leave him a nominal sum to prove that the omission was intentional and considered. Make it exactly $1, I said. The words felt cold and sharp like a winter frost. It include a clause stating that if he attempts to contest any part of this will, he forfeits even that dollar. I want it written in plain English, Arthur. I want him to know that I was perfectly lucid when I decided that he was no longer my heir. The process of drafting the final document took hours. I watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of light as Arthur's secretary brought in the revised pages. When the final version was placed before me, it felt heavier than the sum of its parts. It was no longer just a legal document, it was my final word. It was the response to his silence, the answer to his "don't ever call me again." I picked up the fountain pen. The barrel was cool and heavy in my hand. As I pressed the nib to the parchment, I felt a strange, shimmering sense of release. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room, a definitive rhythmic rasp that echoed against the wood-paneled walls. With every loop of my signature, I was cutting the ties that had kept me anchored to a son who didn't want me. I was no longer the mother waiting for a phone call that would never come. I was a woman who had decided that her legacy would be defined by her own choices, not by the cruelty of another. When I finished, I blotted the ink and handed the pen back to Arthur. I felt exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion, the kind that follows a long day of hard labor in the garden. I had pruned the dead weight, I had cleared the ground. "It's done, Alina," Arthur said, his voice tinged with a solemnity that bordered on respect. "This is ironclad. I'll have the witnesses sign, and the original will stay in our vault. You have a copy for your records." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, rising from the chair. My heart, which the doctor had said was strong, beat with a steady, rhythmic thrum. I walked out of the office and into the bright, unforgiving light of the afternoon. I didn't feel like a woman who had lost a son. I felt like a woman who had finally found her own life, tucked away under the layers of expectations and duty I had carried for far too long. The silence between Julian and me was no longer a void, it was a fortress, and I had just finished building the walls. The sidewalk felt different beneath my heels as I left Arthur's office, a strange buoyancy in my step that I hadn't felt in decades. For years, every financial decision I made had been filtered through the suffocating lens of Julian's future. Should I renovate the kitchen? No, better to save that for Julian's down payment. Should I take that trip to Italy I'd always dreamed of? No, Julian might need a bridge loan for his next ill-advised business venture. That weight was suddenly, spectacularly gone. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy rucksack up a steep mountain for 30 years, only to realize the person I was carrying it for had already taken a helicopter to the top and forgotten I existed. I simply dropped the bag and kept walking. I reached my car, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't reflexively check my phone for a missed call or a biting text. The screen was dark, and I found I didn't care to light it. 2 weeks later, I found myself on the rugged northern coast. I didn't book a suite at the polished, sanitized resorts Vanessa would have preferred, the kind with white glove service and sterile beige walls. Instead, I rented a salt-sprayed cottage perched on a cliffside where the wind howled with a prehistoric ferocity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and cold brine, a sharp, honest smell that seemed to clear the cobwebs from the very back of my lungs. I spent my mornings walking the shoreline, my boots sinking into the wet, dark sand, leaving tracks that the tide would inevitably erase. There was a profound, quiet peace in that erasure. I was learning, day by salty day, that I didn't need to leave a permanent mark on Julian to justify my own existence. I began to spend the money, the Julian Fund, as I'd started calling it in the private theater of my mind. I bought a set of professional grade watercolors, heavy, textured paper, and brushes made of fine sable. I hadn't touched a palette since before I was pregnant with him, back when I thought my life would be a canvas of my own making. My fingers were stiff at first, the joints complaining, but as I sat on the weathered porch overlooking the gray, churning expanse of the Atlantic, the muscle memory returned. I wasn't painting for a gallery or for praise. I was painting because the way the morning light hit the crest of a breaking wave was a miracle I had been too distracted to notice for 30 years. I bought a cashmere throw that cost more than my first car, simply because I liked the way the fibers felt against my skin on chilly evenings. I ate oysters and drank crisp, cold Chablis at a local tavern, sitting alone at a small wooden table, but never once feeling lonely. It was at that tavern that I met Sarah and Thomas. They were retirees who had moved to the coast to grow heirloom tomatoes and rebuild old wooden boats. They didn't know I was a discarded mother. They didn't know about the $1 clause or the bitterness of a son's silence. To them, I was just Alina, the woman with the sharp wit and the keen eye for the shifting coastal light. We spent long, meandering evenings arguing about literature and the most effective way to keep deer out of a garden. They valued my perspective, not my bank account. For the first time, I realized that Julian's disapproval had been a shadow I'd mistaken for my own skin, without him constantly telling me, implicitly or explicitly, that I was overbearing or out of touch. I found I was actually quite pleasant company. The irony was a delicious, slow-burning fire that kept me warm. Julian had intended his silence to be a weapon. He thought that by cutting me off, he was depriving me of the very air I needed to breathe. He expected me to wither in the vacuum he created, to beg for his attention, to eventually come crawling back to him and Vanessa with a checkbook and 1,000 apologies for the sin of existing. Instead, his silence was the greatest gift he had ever given me. It was the silence of a library, a space for reflection, for study, and for the quiet, unadulterated joy of one's own thoughts. By blocking me, he had inadvertently removed the static from my life. I no longer woke up wondering what mood he would be in. I no longer curated my sentences to avoid the sting of his sharp tongue. I was free, I was vibrant. I was a woman of independent means, and for the first time in my life, I was the protagonist of my own story, rather than a supporting character in his tragedy. He wanted to be rid of me, and in doing so, he finally allowed me to be rid of the version of myself that lived only for him. I was sitting on the weathered porch of my cottage, the watercolor paper drying under the weight of a smooth river stone, when the world I had left behind made its first clumsy attempt to intrude. It didn't come through a blocked phone line or a direct message, but through a long, rambling email from Brenda, a woman who had spent 30 years positioning herself at the nexus of our social circle's gossip. Brenda was the kind of person who specialized in checking in when she smelled blood in the water. She wrote with a feigned concern that was as thin as cheap tissue paper, her sentences bloated with artificial sympathy and prayers that felt more like interrogations. But beneath the fluff, the details she provided were jagged, specific, and very real. She mentioned, with a series of performative sighs, that Julian and Vanessa's lifestyle boutique, a venture I'd always known was more about curated vanity than actual commerce, was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. Apparently, they had signed an ironclad, 5-year lease on a flagship space in a neighborhood they couldn't afford, betting everything on a high-end, minimalist aesthetic that the current market was rejecting with a cold, hard shrug. But the most chilling part of Brenda's report wasn't the failing business. It was the whispered rumors circulating among their creditors. Julian had been leveraging his future inheritance to secure bridge loans. He had sold a version of the future to his lenders where I was already gone, or at the very least, a version where I was a silent, compliant ATM waiting to be tapped. He had collateralized my life to fund his delusions. I felt a strange, cold weight settle in my chest as I read those words, the screen of my laptop glowing like a sickly eye in the twilight. It wasn't the sharp, hot sting of betrayal. I had already processed that, had already felt the knife turn months ago. This was different. It was the heavy, leaden realization of a prophecy finally fulfilled. I looked out at the ocean, where the gray waves were churning with a restless, hungry energy. The weather was turning, the horizon was a bruised, angry purple, and the air had grown heavy with the metallic scent of a coming storm. It felt appropriate, a mirror to the atmospheric shift in Julian's life. While I was learning the art of the wash and the gradient, painting the subtle grays of a coastal morning, Julian was drowning in the deep end of his own arrogance. He and Vanessa had built a house of cards on a foundation of my expected generosity, and now the wind was starting to pick up, whistling through the cracks they had refused to see. I didn't feel the rush of vindication I might have once expected. There was no "I told you so" ringing in my ears, no triumphant surge of joy at his misfortune. Instead, there was a profound, somber clarity. I saw Julian not as the powerful, independent man he pretended to be in that final, biting phone call, but as a child who had run away from home in a fit of pique, only to realize he'd forgotten to pack a lunch or a coat. He had wanted me gone, and he had got his wish with surgical precision, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that my absence meant the total absence of his safety net. He was finally free of my interference, my judgment, and my stifling presence, but he was also free of my protection. He had cut the tether, and now he was drifting into a dark sea, realizing too late that the tether was the only thing keeping him from the rocks. I thought about the no contact rule. It was his rule, his wall, his silence. I respected it with a religious, almost monastic fervor. I didn't reply to Brenda's email, nor did I forward it to my lawyer. I simply deleted it and watched the screen turn black. I didn't call Julian's bank or his landlord. I remained a ghost, a specter haunting the edges of his financial ruin, invisible and unreachable. I could almost feel the frantic, jagged energy radiating from him across the miles, the late-night arguments with Vanessa in their overpriced, echoing apartment, the desperate calculations on the back of napkins, the checking of the mail for a check or a letter that would never arrive. He was waiting for the mother he had discarded to sense his distress and save him from the consequences of discarding her. He expected my maternal instinct to override my self-respect. But that woman, the one who would have sold her own soul to keep him from a moment's discomfort, was dead. She had drowned in the very salt water I was now using to rinse my brushes. I was someone else now, a woman who understood that sometimes the most merciful thing you can do for a man who insists on his own destruction is to let him find the bottom. Only there, in the quiet dark of his own making, would he realize that the water wasn't his enemy. The weight of his own entitlement was what was pulling him down. And I, sitting on my porch as the first raindrops began to hiss against the wooden deck, would not be the one to pull him up. The rain didn't just fall, it claimed the landscape, a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the cedar shingles that felt like the heartbeat of the house itself. I sat in my armchair, the one with the slightly frayed velvet arms that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, watching the silver sheets of water blur the line between the sky and the sea. In my hand, a heavy stoneware mug of Lapsang Souchong sent up curls of smoky steam, the scent sharp and medicinal, grounding me in the present moment. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the chaos I knew was currently detonating in Julian's world. The first tremor had arrived via a notification on my phone, not a call from him, of course, but a frantic, rambling series of texts from my sister, Elena. Elena has always been the family's self appointed diplomat, a woman who believes that every wound can be healed with a soft word and a compromise, regardless of how deep the rot goes. Her messages were a frantic stream of consciousness, punctuated by excessive exclamation points and a palpable sense of panic. Julian is distraught, Mary. He's absolutely confused. He went to the bank to finalize a bridge loan for the gallery and they told him your name isn't on the assets anymore. They said everything is tied up in something called an irrevocable trust. He's in a state, Mary. He says he can't even get a meeting with your lawyers. Please just call him. This has to be a mistake. I stared at the screen for a long time, the blue light reflecting in the darkened window against the backdrop of the storm. It wasn't a mistake. It was a masterpiece of legal architecture. Months ago, while Julian was busy curating his silence and Vanessa was busy curating their Instagram perfect life, I had been sitting in a sterile, glass-walled office in the city, watching a silver-haired attorney named Marcus systematically dismantle Julian's future. We had moved the house, the investment portfolios, and the remaining liquid assets into a series of irrevocable trusts. I had designated a board of trustees, none of whom were family, and stripped Julian of his status as the primary beneficiary. In the eyes of the law, I no longer owned my wealth in a way that Julian could leverage. I was a tenant of my own estate, a guest of my own legacy, and Julian was a stranger at the gate. He had tried to use me as a ghost signatory, a silent partner in his failing ambitions. He had walked into that bank with the arrogance of a man who believed his inheritance was a natural law like gravity or the tides. I could almost see the scene. Julian in his slim-fit Italian suit, leaning over the mahogany desk, sliding papers across to a loan officer, confident that my name would open the vault. And then the cold, clinical correction. The realization that the well had run dry, not because I was dead, but because I had chosen to live entirely without him. Elena's next message came through 10 minutes later, the vibration of the phone buzzing against the side table like a trapped insect. He's losing the gallery space, Mary. They're calling in the personal guarantees. He's crying. I've never heard him like this. He says he doesn't understand how you could do this without telling him. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He had blocked me. He had told me in no uncertain terms never to call him again. He had built a wall of silence and expected me to sit behind it, quietly holding the bag for his failures. He wanted the autonomy of an adult but the allowance of a child. He wanted to be free of my voice but tethered to my bank account. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The smoke of the leaves coated my tongue, bitter and deep. I didn't reply to Elena. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't pace the floor or wring my hands. I simply watched a single raindrop track its way down the glass, a slow, wobbling descent that mirrored the collapse of Julian's carefully constructed house of cards. The power of the silence I had maintained for over a year was no longer a burden, it was a fortress. Julian was confused because he had mistaken my quiet for compliance. He had forgotten that silence isn't just an absence of sound, it's a space where reality eventually catches up to you. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful, hungry sound that tore at the trees, but inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of tea and the absolute, unwavering weight of a mother who had finally learned how to say no. He had wanted me gone, and now, in the most literal financial sense, I was a ghost. And ghosts, as Julian was beginning to learn, cannot sign checks. The silence didn't just break, it shattered. It happened an hour after Alina's frantic messages, just as the storm outside seemed to catch its second wind, rattling the window panes in their frames. My phone, which had been a quiet companion for over a year, a repository for weather alerts and the occasional check in from my sister, suddenly became a live wire. It vibrated with such frequency that it skittered across the mahogany surface of the side table, a violent staccato of buzzing that felt like a physical assault on the stillness I had worked so hard to cultivate. I didn't pick it up at first. I watched it. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the darkened room with a harsh, clinical blue, and there it was. A name I hadn't seen on my lock screen in 14 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Julian. He had unblocked me. The digital gate he had slammed shut with such theatrical finality had been kicked wide open, not out of love or remorse, but out of a sudden, desperate thirst. The notifications began to pile up, one on top of the other, a scrolling ledger of his undoing. The first few were cautious, almost nauseatingly sweet. "Mom, are you there? I've been thinking about you lately. I've been meaning to reach out, but things have been so crazy with the gallery." I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a vestigial twin of the motherly instinct that used to compel me to fix his every problem. But I remained still. I watched the bubbles appear and disappear, the 3 dots of the typing indicator dancing like a nervous heartbeat. When I didn't respond within 3 minutes, the tone shifted. The faux concern was a thin veneer and it cracked almost instantly. "I heard from Alina that you're doing some restructuring with the estate. I'm sure there's just a misunderstanding with the bank. Give me a call so we can clear this up. I really need to talk to you, Mom. It's urgent." The mom felt like a weapon, a tool he was reaching for only because his other levers had failed. I thought about the day he told me I was suffocating him, the day he told me my presence in his life was a tax he was no longer willing to pay. He had wanted independence. Now he had it in its purest, most terrifying form. Then came the barrage. The messages began to arrive in rapid fire succession, the vibration of the phone constant now, a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. "Why aren't you answering? I know you're seeing these. Don't do this, Mary. This isn't funny. You're putting my entire career at risk. Do you have any idea what you've done? The lawyers are saying I have no standing. That's impossible. You can't just cut me out. I'm your son." The transition from Mom to Mary was the tell. The mask was off. The desperation was curdling into the familiar, sharp-edged rage that had defined our final months together. I leaned back into the velvet of my chair, the tea now cold in my hand. I made a conscious choice. I would not turn off the phone, but I would not turn on the read receipts. I wanted him to scream into the void. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the silence he had gifted me. It took a monumental amount of strength not to swipe the screen, not to see the full text of his mounting hysteria. I could visualize him in his sleek, glass-walled office, the one I had paid the security deposit on, pacing the floor, his face flushed, his thumb hovering over the glass as he waited for the little blue check marks that would never come. The messages turned ugly then, a digital autopsy of his entitlement. "You're a spiteful woman. You've always been controlling. This is why I blocked you in the first place. You think you can buy my respect. You think you can starve me into coming back. Answer me, pick up the phone." The irony was a physical weight in the room. His "don't ever call me again" had been a command he expected me to obey until it no longer suited his balance sheet. He had wanted me silenced when I was asking for his time, for a Sunday dinner, for a phone call on my birthday. But now that the silence was costing him his gallery, his reputation, and his lifestyle, he was begging for the very thing he had discarded. I watched the screen as a new message popped up, shorter than the others, almost breathless. "Please, just answer. I'm losing everything." I looked at the words until they blurred into white lines against the blue. He wasn't losing everything, he was simply losing the things he hadn't earned. He was finding out that a mother's love is a sanctuary, but a mother's legacy is a choice. The desperate pursuit he was engaged in wasn't for me, but for the safety net I represented. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For years, I had been the one waiting for the phone to ring, the one checking for a sign of life. Now, the roles were reversed, and the power of my silence was absolute. I set the phone face down on the table, the muffled vibrations continuing to pulse like the dying gasps of a relationship that had been one sided for far too long. He wanted to know why I wasn't answering. The answer was simple, though I would never send it. I was finally listening to exactly what he told me to do. I was staying away. The silence of the house, which had become my sanctuary over the last few days, was shattered not by the digital hum of a phone, but by the physical violence of a fist against wood. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding that shook the heavy oak of my front door, a sound so desperate and demanding that it vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. I didn't rush. I stood up from my velvet chair, smoothed the front of my silk trousers, and walked down the hallway with a measured pace that felt like a prayer of intention. When I reached the entryway, I didn't open the main door immediately. I looked through the side light, the narrow pane of decorative glass that distorted the world outside. There stood Julian. He didn't look like the polished, untouchable gallery owner who graced the pages of local lifestyle magazines. He looked haggard. His hair, usually styled with a precision that bordered on the clinical, was a frantic mess, standing up in tufts where he had clearly been running his fingers through it in agitation. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a raw, pink exhaustion, and his jaw was set so tight I could see the muscles leaping in his neck. He looked diminished, stripped of the arrogance that usually acted as his armor. I unlocked the heavy inner door but kept the mesh screen door latched. It was a thin, perforated barrier, but in that moment it felt as impenetrable as a castle wall. We stood inches apart, separated only by that fine wire weave. The air between us was thick with the smell of the coming rain and the sour, sharp scent of his stress. Mary, he breathed, his voice cracking on the single syllable. He didn't call me Mom. He was still using my name like a shield or perhaps a weapon. He gripped the handle of the screen door and pulled, finding it locked. His face contorted, the desperation bubbling over into a familiar, sharp-edged rage. Open the door. We need to talk about this. The lawyers, they're telling me things that can't be true. You can't just cut me out. You're being spiteful. It's petty, even for you. I didn't flinch. I watched him with a clinical sort of detachment, noting the way his hands shook as he gripped the door frame. Spiteful? I asked, my voice coming out low and steady, a sharp contrast to his frantic pitch. Yes, spiteful. He shouted, his face reddening. And unmaternal. What kind of mother does this to her only son? You're trying to ruin me because I asked for a little space, because I wanted to live my own life without you suffocating me. This is a power play, Mary. It's cruel. You're using your money to punish me for being independent. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I didn't feel the urge to cry, nor did I feel the heat of anger. I felt a profound, heavy clarity. Julian, I said, and the use of his name seemed to quiet him for a fleeting second. You asked for silence. Do you remember? You told me quite clearly to never call you again. You told me that my presence in your life was a tax you were no longer willing to pay. You wanted to be free of me. I didn't mean for you to take my inheritance, he hissed, lining his forehead against the screen. That's my future. That's the gallery. That's everything I've built. No, I corrected him gently. That is everything I built, and you told me you wanted no part of me. I simply honored your request, Julian. I gave you the silence you demanded. I gave you the distance you insisted upon. If I am no longer your mother in your daily life, why would I be your mother in my will? You asked to be removed from my present. I merely removed you from my future." The shift in his expression was instantaneous. The rage didn't vanish, but it was eclipsed by a sudden, chilling realization. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw that the woman who used to bend over backward to earn his affection was gone. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that he was left grasping at the air. He wasn't the one setting the terms anymore. He was a man standing on a porch, begging for the grace of a woman he had discarded, and for the first time in his life, he realized that words have consequences that outlive the emotions that prompted them. He had wanted independence. I was finally giving him the full, terrifying weight of it. Julian didn't scream again. That was the most telling part of our final exchange. The fire of his indignation, which usually burned with a bright, performative heat, had been doused by the cold, hard reality of my resolve. He looked at the screen door, then at me, his eyes searching for a crack in the porcelain of my expression, a hint of the soft, yielding mother he had known for 30 years. He found none. I stood there, my hands folded loosely at my waist, a woman who had finally learned the value of her own peace over the price of his presence. He turned away, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look like a tired, defeated stranger instead of the vibrant, untouchable entrepreneur he pretended to be. He descended the porch steps slowly, each footfall on the wood sounding like a gavel strike in the quiet evening air. I watched through the mesh as he reached his car, a sleek silver thing that I had helped him lease 3 years ago during a moment of maternal weakness. He didn't look back. The engine turned over with a low, predatory growl, and then he was gone, the red of his taillights bleeding into the gray twilight of the driveway until the darkness swallowed them whole. I turned the deadbolt. The click was final, a sharp, metallic period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I leaned my back against the door for a moment, closing my eyes and listening to the silence of the house. I expected to feel the familiar hollow ache, the one that usually followed our confrontations like a physical bruise, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a lightness as if the house itself had just exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. I walked through the foyer and into the living room, my bare feet silent on the polished hardwood. The house didn't feel empty. For months, I had mistaken the absence of his voice for a void, a terrifying vacuum I needed to fill with apologies and concessions. But now, as I looked around at the curated beauty of my home, I realized it wasn't empty, it was clean. It was a space I had reclaimed, filled now with my own breath, my own preferences, and my own quiet, hard-won strength. The air felt scrubbed of the tension that had hung like a heavy fog for years. I looked at the mahogany side table, the one he used to criticize for being too traditional and stagnant, and I ran my hand over its smooth, cool surface. It wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore, it was mine, untainted by the constant, nagging need for his approval. I moved toward the back of the house, toward the glass doors that led to the garden. This was the place where I had spent so many nights weeping, staring at a silent phone as if I could command it to ring through sheer force of will. I remembered the nights I had sat in the dark, wondering where I had failed as a mother, what crucial ingredient I had missed in the recipe of his upbringing that had turned him so sour and entitled. But as I stepped out onto the stone patio, those memories felt distant, like a story I had read about someone else's life in a discarded book. The garden was bathed in the amber and gold glow of a setting sun, the long shadows of the oaks stretching across the lawn like protective arms. I walked to the stone bench nestled among the hydrangeas, the ones I had planted the very week after he told me to never call him again. They were in full bloom now, heavy clusters of blue and violet that nodded in the gentle evening breeze, thriving in the soil I had tended with my own two hands while my heart was busy breaking. I sat down, the stone cool and solid beneath me. I didn't reach for my phone to see if he had texted a final insult or a desperate plea. I didn't check the time to see how long it had been since he left. I simply watched the sky turn from a brilliant gold to a deep, bruised purple. The journey from a broken-hearted mother to this woman, this version of Mary who finally knew her worth, had been paved with the very silence Julian had intended as a punishment. He had tried to use his absence as a weapon to starve me of affection, to make me small and desperate, but he had inadvertently given me the solitude I needed to find myself again. I had reclaimed my dignity not through a grand gesture of defiance or a shouting match, but through the quiet, steady acceptance of his choice. He had wanted a life without me, and I had been gracious enough to grant it to him entirely, right down to the last cent of my estate. The will was signed, the papers filed, and the assets reallocated to the local children's hospital and a scholarship fund for young artists who actually valued the struggle of creation over the vanity of the result. My legacy would not be a pile of gold handed to a son who despised the hand that fed him. It would be a bridge for those who had nothing but the will to build something beautiful. I felt a profound, settling peace in that decision. My life's work would belong to those who cherished the opportunity, not those who felt entitled to the spoils of a love they refused to return. As the first stars began to prick through the velvet sky, I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I was no longer waiting for a call that would never come. I was no longer waiting for an apology, a reconciliation, or a sign of growth that Julian was incapable of showing. I was simply living, a woman in her own garden, finally at home in a sanctuary of my own making, where the silence was no longer a burden but a blessing.